Hey, this is Ditzian. I'm one of the many people cutting fantastic cards for the Champions Briefs for the NCAA Nationals debate topic. I wrote a topic analysis and I also cut cards for the Champions Briefs, but I want to take this video to cover some issues about how to prepare and do well at Nationals that I didn't get to really cover in my written topic analyses. So a few of the things that we'll just cover are how to prep for this tournament, relevant ways in which you strategize that are different from how you would approach usual tournaments, what your speeches should sound like, and just sort of general thoughts about the tournament. I guess the first place to start would be on how to approach writing and preparing case positions, and also how to do blocks. So for AF case positions, I think the ideal AF is something that's positional, that's simple, that has like a sort of simple driven thesis behind it, that doesn't depend on a lot of the, but also doesn't depend on a lot of the ambiguities that this topic has that I previously discussed in the topic analysis, such as the level and extent that someone could be obligated to react to an injustice, what exactly injustice constitutes, and what inaction might entail, because someone could just not be doing enough. Anyway, there are all these sorts of vague ways in which the topic could either yield some extreme examples, or the judge will just have a difficult time imagining what the resolution really means. So I think that an AF that has a simple thesis behind it, that doesn't depend on any sort of these strange ways of interpreting the resolution, is probably the best sort of AF you want to pick for writing. I know that there is temptation to run AFs that would satisfy this burden, that are have like some sort of straightforward burden, like for example disproving the act omission distinction. These are really strategic, but some of the contentional offense might require more nuancing, and while disproving the act omission distinction would, something like a case like that would logically disprove the topic, you might need something a little more nuanced and also persuasive than that, that doesn't rely on tricky technical philosophic arguments that some judges might not be familiar with or capable of understanding. So I think that instead a better time investment would be, first of all, I think it's another reason why you should also be weary of case positions like this is because as you go in depth on these issues as well, there's a sort of level of diminishing returns, because as the arguments become more and more technical, for example, the more and more complex ways that you disprove the act omission distinction, the more complicated it gets and the harder it becomes to understand, and so then you are limited in your ability to make a broader appeal to the panel of judges that you will likely be debating in front of, because it's not going to be just one person, nor is it going to be three judges where you could just go for the 2-1 decision. In this case, I believe Nationals has 2 judges per panel, which means that if you get split, you are actually in some way disadvantaged. But we'll cover that later. So as far as case positions that I think would work well, I think that case position that can make a sort of diverse set of appeals while still making all of those appeals seem to be wrapped around some sort of cohesive thesis is definitely the strategy to go for. Case positions, for example, like Emotivism, Util, and Dayon are definitely ideal on this resolution because they, first of all, can be used in a preemptive way to address a lot of negative cases, but they also can have lots of offense under it that might be able to preemptively turn a lot of common NCs that you might address, which will make your 1ARs a lot easier. But we'll go over that in later. Another thing that I think that you should start thinking about when writing AF case positions on this topic is perhaps also a powerful ballad story that you could rely on and construct for the 2AR that allows the debate round to almost seem to come full circle. That way you create a clear and concise picture of what the judge is endorsing when they sign the ballot. And I think that if you create a strong picture for the for what the AF is and why they're voting for it by the 2AR, you should have the persuasive advantage in all of your AF rounds. Another thing to also keep in mind is to try and make your standard a bit broader. I think I had previously discussed this before, but just to retouch on this, you want to make sure that your standard is a bit broader so that we can diversify the contentional offense. So that way, because the thing is at a tournament like this, where your panels will be a little bit more diverse. You can't really rely on tricky framework arguments or theory to produce layers in the debate round. Instead, you have to have sort of a more of an equal balancing act between framework arguments, interpretational issues such as like an observation, which you should probably dedicate a small amount of time to that, and then perhaps an equal balance between contentional arguments and framework arguments. So that way you have just, I guess, like, so you have an equal balance between them. You're not going to be able to get a lot of payoff from like tricky theory arguments or any really dense philosophy, at least as far as your lay positions are concerned. So an equal balance between the two is definitely what I would do. Another thing I think you should also keep in mind, I think that this is going to be really prevalent on this topic. A lot of people are going to sort of resort to this use of metaphorical reasoning, perhaps trying to affirm the topic using some sort of example like Good Samaritan laws or the example of like a drowning child. I would be careful though not to rely too heavily on story creation or trying to create this concise narrative about the AC, because also if you have too many of those, it also becomes difficult to create a concise ballad story. So sticking with one good concise message, like for example, we should be like generally obligated to help others in need if there's like a minimal cost to ourselves, or perhaps that altruism is just some sort of example in which altruism just prevails over everything, would be a good concise story that the AC should paint for lay judges. Another thing I think that would probably be important is, in addition to your lay positions, I think that you should have some sort of technical position, something that might be like distinct from the other arguments that are generally going to be run on the topic. I think actually in my topic analysis I actually covered this, the case, for example, of continental philosophy and other really interesting philosophic arguments that people don't usually run and don't have as much prep against. A lot of people might be tempted to just put like an expansion on their lay cases and just make it a little lengthier. I don't think this is necessarily strategic though, because any good opponent with a good panel in front of them will probably just have good prep on stock cases like this. So I think that perhaps writing something new and out there for your rounds where you know that you have a judge that's experienced and can handle it would probably be also a good idea as a backup, so that way you have what I would like to call the adaptive advantage, because then obviously you're going to be just operating on a higher level than your opponent. As for negatives, I think that, especially a tournament like this, negating is obviously going to be kind of tricky. First of all, as far as the topic is concerned, the negative is sort of walking this very fine line between hedonism and just the idea of being able to be generally free. And so the best way, I think, to create this idea that people need to be innately free without painting them as selfish would obviously be trying to conversely paint the AF as in some way overburdensome and unfair, and perhaps even interventionist. I think that good examples of this might be like, you could point out that Good Samaritan laws and other instances in which the government tries to enforce something similar to this resolution could be bad, and I think that could destroy the rosy picture that the affirmative is trying to create, and you would probably make the AF seem more like a thorn in the side of people who are just trying to be generally free, and perhaps that might be a good story to paint. Also, I think that another issue that the negative will probably be dealing with is that they don't get a good return on long NCs. Like, your negative case should be only 2 minutes long. Anything longer than that, you're going to start reaching the danger zone here, because there's a level of diminishing returns on the amount of time you invest on your NC versus the amount of time you could be using to develop other issues. So that brings us to the other question, which is that if you're going to be spending such little time on the NC, what do you spend the rest of your NC strategy doing? I think that things that I've seen that have been successful in the past is perhaps having like very simple philosophic off cases, like maybe like skepticism, or just proving the act omission distinction is true. And those would perhaps logically also entail a negative ballad, but also would be a short and concise layer that you could also build that could become a voting issue that lay judges would actually probably be able to understand. So I think that that probably would be a good strategy, just going for like an NC, an off case, and then relying very heavily on good blocks which I think you'll find a lot in the champions briefs, and also just making smart, simple framework arguments against the AC. You want to spend a lot of time responding to the AF, because the 1AR is likely going to be spending a lot of time in the AF anyway. So also, that being said, though, I think it's important to have something like a critique, maybe some theory arguments, or some other tricks up your sleeve, just in case you do actually get a decent panel and you want to just have an all-out strategy. I think that that's also really important, because then you could also have the adaptive advantage. Because obviously, you don't want to run lay prep in front of someone that you didn't have to. The other thing is, so with those, I guess, like positions, with that said, I think that the next thing we should address is like how to strategize. Something I previously mentioned is that you will be having panels of 2 judges, which is a little bit trickier, because you have to try and get both ballots every time. If you split your ballots too often, you are guaranteed not to break, because the tournament relies on ballot count. So having a case position that is positional, that can still have some preclusive like arguments in it, some arguments that are both intuitive but also have some really good strategic implications inside of them that are explicitly labeled, would be a really good idea. I think like the same way that people say something like that is intuitively preclusive, like extinction precludes, or that practical reason is the most important thing because to question it would just concede the value of practical reason. Those sorts of arguments actually work fairly well on a intuitive level that would work well in front of both judges that are experienced and inexperienced, and so I think that that's a really good way to, I guess, think in terms of what preparation you should be doing, rather than going for anything like some crazy critiques or some abusive T-shells or something like that, because a lot of times you're going to have rounds where you can't really rely on those strategies. So that is definitely something I would do. Another thing that I think will also help you do better with handling the situation is having lots and lots of practice rounds in front of lots of different judges. Try and debate in front of as many people as you possibly can. Parents, coaches, people with a debate experience, former debaters, in front of your fellow students, and try and get a good feel of how different people evaluate debate rounds differently. This brings me to now the next part of this video, which is how should your next speeches work after the 1AC and the 1NC has been read. So the first obviously thing I should address is the 1AR. The 1AR I think is a great example of why casing is so important. You want to be able to pick contentional arguments that you could offensively leverage against common negative constructives. This is obviously there's obviously going to be NCs that you're not always going to be able to preempt, but that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, because they should function as offense anyway, so it's not like you actually lose in terms of that time investment. Perhaps you just don't get as much of a benefit as you would have normally. Anyway, you want to make sure that you spend a lot of time on your AC, making extensions and comparing your offense and trying to find ways to make your AF come on a higher level than the negative case, because you're not going to have enough time to go run a bunch of turns or new offs in the 1AR like you might at other tournaments. So I think that some good ratios to perhaps stand by would be like 3-to-1, where you spend 3 minutes on the app and like a minute turning the negative constructive or making framework arguments, or maybe even a little more evenly split in those instances, or for example 2-to-1-to-1, depending on the number of off cases the negative is actually using. So that way you have a proper amount of time allocation that gives you enough time to I guess like crystallize the round, but that's really something for the 2AR. Anyway, the point is that you are under a time crunch, so being able to leverage the AC against the NC is a really important factor in terms of effective time management in your 1AR. So the next speech after that is obviously the 2NR. The 2NR is in a bit of a tough position because even though you do have a lot of rebuttal time, the AF the judges that you will have are a lot less experienced, and so trying to actually remember the entirety of a 6-minute 2NR and all the voting issues within it is actually a little bit more difficult for the average layperson to understand. I think part of this is because people generally remember just the first and last things that they hear. This is something that the psychologists call a sequencing effect, and so as a result, there's a lot of the middle parts of a 2NR that are lost, and as a result, you sort of lose the persuasive advantage, especially when you consider the 2AR also has the last opportunity to speak about the debate round. So crystallization, spending a good time on crystallization and voting issues, I think is absolutely essential to win debate rounds at this tournament. So I think that the best way of doing this is, first of all, when you have your 1C, your 1C should only be developing a few voting issues for the debate round. You should have a negative constructive, maybe like an off case, framework endites, and then turn to the app contention. Those should be like 4 or 5 different voting issues that you could possibly go for in the 2NR. And don't go for everything, obviously. But the idea is you only want to have a few of them because that's the amount of issues that most judges will be able to remember at the point in which they are actually signing the ballot. So, in which case, you want to spend a good portion of your time crystallizing and also closing doors for the closing doors to make the 2AR more difficult. And that way, you can sort of bridge that persuasive gap that the app has against you. And then, obviously, you sort of want to end it with some pure, simple, concise voting issues that the judge will remember. 2, 3 tops. Anything more than that, and you'll start getting more and more diminishing returns. So that is likely how you want to have your 2NRs look. A good focus on crystallization and trying to close that persuasive advantage. The 2AR is also can actually be kind of tough in lay or in rounds where you might have a tech judge and also a lay judge. So one of the things that I think a lot of AF debaters are tempted to do is they want to respond to everything that's said in the 2NR because the 2NR seems like such a long speech and you don't want to forget anything and not and sort of lose as a result of undercoverage. I think that you should avoid this temptation because just because you get more points doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually getting closer to the ballot. And I think that instead you should be spending time crystallizing the round for the judge and just collapsing to a couple layers that you know that you're winning and explaining why they're the most important. Something that I had previously mentioned before in this talk was that you want to have a concise ballot story, something that explains why, something that explains what the judge is explicitly endorsing when they vote AF and why they should. In addition, there also needs to be a metric for determining the round. This is often seen in overviews where people say, this is how you're determining the debate round, these are the key issues that are happening, and then you clarify why the AF is then on top when in light of these issues. So that is what you really want to focus on, is constructing a clear and concise ballot story, more so than focusing on responding to everything the 2NR has said. That being said, you do want to spend like a minute and a half of your time perhaps addressing the 2NR voting issues and showing why they're also not relevant. So that way, since you do have the last opportunity to speak, you should also take that opportunity to deconstruct the negatives ballot story, so that way the last thing that the judge remembers is that your ballot story does make sense, and they also remember the arguments that you've made as to why your opponent's doesn't. And I think that's probably the best way of addressing 2NR is to focus mostly on crystallization and summarizing why you're on top, rather than going for the line by line. So those are the ways that your speeches should look. Now that that's sort of finished, I think that the best way to sort of finish this up is just some general notes about nationals. So first of all, I think that a lot of people at first were like griping about this topic, but when you really think about it, this topic actually does have a lot of good merit to it. And that's probably the reason why there have been so many topics picked like this before. There are lots of actually really good framework arguments. There are lots of philosophers that really do speak about this issue, so there really is topic literature about it. And even if this topic doesn't have good explicit literature, like say like a drones topic would, or something like that. There are lots of really great framework arguments that you can really learn from preparing for this topic. In addition, I think that's really important to learn how to adapt in front of some judges versus others, especially when you have someone, say like me, on a panel, and also say someone like my mom on a panel. Sometimes that's going to happen in your debate career, and I think that a tournament like this is a really good educational experience that will teach you how to adapt in those situations. So good luck to everyone. I hope you have a great time.